Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. My task is to set the scene, essentially, for the discussion groups which are coming up and to get you thinking about how you can use your research to generate more impact and what you could do to transform your impact culture. Thank you, Jesse, for the great presentation we've just heard from you about your new initiative. And I have to say that when I first heard about the Adaptation Research Alliance, I was really excited because unusually every organization that wants to join has to sign up to the principles we've just heard to encourage us to engage in more transdisciplinary, action-led research that's inclusive, empowering, and impactful. And these are goals that I know many of the peatlands research community hold dear. As we all know, peatlands are one of the world's most significant carbon stores, and damaged peatlands are a major contributor to climate change. COP26 is underlining the urgency of producing the kinds of evidence that can drive policy and action, positioning peatlands as a superpowered nature-based solution to the climate crisis. The kind of change embedded in the principles Jesse has just spoken about is the kind of change I want to see. Because despite the all-pervasiveness of the impact agenda nowadays, it's done very little to change how most of us do our research or how we engage with stakeholders. In fact, there's evidence that in addition to the great good that has been done by funders and governments who've incentivized their researchers to generate impact, there's now a growing range of negative, unintended consequences. So I work as the research lead for the IUCN UK Peatland programme, but I've heard similar complaints from people across the peatland policy and NGO community. There's a feeling that researchers want to use us to get impact, and whether real or perceived, there's a growing sense that the impact agenda has created conflicts of interest for researchers whose funding and promotion prospects are now linked to whether people like us will use their research or not. The reason we're in this situation is because universities and research institutes have tried to facilitate change from the top down via extrinsic incentives. As a result, the impact culture in many institutions is more about being able to evidence and communicate tangible impacts, instrumental impacts, things that we can measure and sell more than actually serving the public good or helping people in need. I want you to pause and ask yourself a question. What is my impact culture? You may think about your institution, you might think about your research group, whoever you work most closely with, but whatever scale comes to mind, I want you to think about how healthy you feel your impact culture is. To answer this question accurately, you're going to need a definition, and my colleague, Professor Johan Feisi, and I recently published this definition. Impact culture is about communities of people with complementary purpose who use their research to benefit society. Now, a healthy impact culture emerges from clear individual and shared purpose, generates impacts that are based on rigorous, ethical, and action-oriented research, forms and is lived out by groups of people as they interact with both academic and non-academic communities, and builds internal capacity and leadership that facilitate the research, community, and purpose that underpin impact. But this is more than just a definition or a framework for me. It's a call to action, to start changing how we work today with the peatland researchers in this session and with our closest colleagues. You don't have to wait for new leadership or new jobs to create the kind of culture that nurtures and inspires you. In my article with Professor Feisi and my forthcoming Impact Culture book, I've laid out a blueprint for grassroots change in our research institution, a change we can all lead ourselves, that starts with understanding our own purpose more clearly than ever before, and ends in more authentic relationships with those who are looking to us for answers, so we can genuinely co-produce research that addresses global challenges. And this is where I want to spend the rest of my time with you and do a deep dive into the community component of the impact culture framework. That's where we're going to focus our discussion groups, which are coming up next. But first, I want to ask you some diagnostic questions about your stakeholder community. I think most of us are pretty good at investing in our academic community, but we really rarely make time to go for coffee with stakeholders, prioritize stakeholder conferences and events, or make an effort to stay in touch with our non-academic partners in the same way we do with our academic collaborators. So how do you and your colleagues measure up to these questions? How much time do you spend outside project meetings and between projects with non-academic partners? Do you return emails and calls and messages on social media from those beyond the academy who engage with your work? Do you make unrealistic promises to non-academic project partners, and how do you deal with non-delivery? And do you tell people you meet at workshops and events that you'll be in touch, but then bin their business cards weeks later? My goal isn't to make you feel guilty, but I do want you to think about the cumulative impact of seemingly small decisions to prioritize, not to prioritize our relationships with our non-academic partners. What we need more of is social capital. And there's both a depth and a breadth component to this. Partly, this is about systematically mapping your stakeholder community, using some sort of stakeholder analysis and identifying the gaps so you can broaden your networks systematically and strategically. But you also need to think about building trust across these networks. Building deep relationships at this scale isn't practical, so I usually prioritize a small number of key relationships. For example, investing in my role as research lead for the IUCN UK Peatland programme and helping with the Global Peatlands initiative. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to discuss actions that could enable you to build the kind of social capital you need to do the sorts of transdisciplinary and transformative research that Jessie was talking about earlier. You might want to discuss an action you started thinking about when I put those questions on the screen a moment ago, or you might want to discuss something bigger. I'm going to conclude with a few ideas so that you might want to think more about in your groups. My first set of ideas is around creating a compassion culture in your team. Compassion is simply empathy with action, enabling us to both connect with the needs of those around us and take appropriate steps to help them. But the hardest part is learning self-compassion, and most of us need help with that. So why not consider hiring a trainer to help you and your team build compassion skills? And then you might follow this up with an acts of kindness challenge, where you all do an act of kindness each day for a week and see what ripple effect this has on the people around you. Or you could run a seminar series on learning from failure to normalize and give people permission to talk about failure and build self-compassion and resilience as a group. My second set of ideas is around experimenting with more creative stakeholder engagement activities. Can you go beyond webinars and stakeholder advisory panels and, say, integrate citizen science into your research or teaching? Create pop-up science shops to engage the public with your research and find out more about what concerns them. Maybe you could organize a knowledge exchange webinar series with equal numbers of sessions led by researchers and stakeholders, focusing on issues relevant to policy and practice. You might arrange a mutual secondment where you work for a few weeks at a stakeholder organization and they work for a few weeks in your organization. Or you could create a boundary organization to interface with Peatland policy and practice and build engagement skills among your colleagues. So when I was at Newcastle University, they called this the Policy Academy. Those are just a few ideas that I've picked up over the years, but now it's time to hear from you. And this is my question. How could you personally build stronger relationships with non-academic partners so you can co-produce transdisciplinary peatland research but has more impact.